Okay, so a few videos back I showed how I make portraits pop using one of my favourite techniques in Photoshop that I call 2010. However, one question has come up time and time again. How would I do that in Lightroom? That's what we're going to do in this video. Now before I dive into Lightroom, there is one thing that I need to clarify from the original video. And that's these 4 adjustment layers that you would have seen. Some folks have asked, what are they? And are they part of the technique? The simple answer is that they are blank and they do absolutely nothing. The only reason I put them there was because 2010 is something that you would do at the end of the retouching, when you would likely have lots of other layers in the layer stack. So to do the technique, you would need to create a merge layer at the top of the layer stack. That's the only reason they're there, just to demonstrate that. However, if you flattened everything and you do have just the one layer, all you need to do is just duplicate it and you're good to go. Right, let's dive into Lightroom. Now, if you want to follow along with this tutorial, you can download the exact same files from a link I've included in the description. But here's a portrait I took of World War II veteran Gordon Drabble. This is the final image and this is the part retouched image. Now I took this portrait with a light source on his face and I used a shallow depth of field, and that's always going to help to make a portrait stand out. But here's how we can add more to it afterwards to really make a portrait pop. Now even though Gordon already has light on his face, one thing I do with pretty much every portrait is add just a little bit more, and in Lightroom we can do that by simply coming over to the new masking section and then choosing a brush. And in the brush settings here, just making sure that there is a decent amount of feather and that the density and the flow are at 100. I'll then come over, in fact, let's just zoom in just a little bit closer. Let's take it to 33. And then what I'll do is I'll brush over the whole of the face so that you can see it covered now with this red overlay. That is the area that will now be affected. And then what I will do is I'll come to the exposure slider and just increase it only a small amount. So in this case here, even if it's 0.1, that's going to make a difference. And you can see when I come to the maskings tab, there's this little marker. If I press down to turn that off and press down to turn it on again, so I can go before and after, you can see already that is helping to make Gordon's face pop. Now referring back to the original video, that 2010 technique, the first part of it was to apply the settings to the whole of the face. So that's what we'll now do in Lightroom, and bizarrely the settings are going to be the same as what they were in Photoshop. Now what I could do now is click to add a new mask and use a brush, but we've already got a mask covering the area that we want to affect with these settings. So I can come over to these 3 little dots here, click on those, and it will say duplicate mask 1. When I click on duplicate mask 1, it will create a copy of it, but what you'll notice as well is that the actual effect has been doubled up, that brightness. It's brought over the exposure adjustment as well. So all I need to do now is just double click on that slider to send it back to 0, because the only sliders I want to use for this particular part are the contrast, the texture and the clarity sliders. Now each of these sliders will produce different kinds of contrast. Contrast itself is quite a hard, impactful kind of contrast. Then you've got clarity, that's kind of like a medium, more kind of refined contrast that adds quite a lot of punch. And then you've got texture, and that will work on very small micro details within the picture. So what I'll do first of all is I'll take the contrast slider up to 20. I'll then come down to the clarity slider and push that up to 20 as well. And then finally the texture slider will bring that up to 20. So that is the first part of the 2010 technique in Lightroom. We've now added contrast and punch to the entire face. And you can see now if I turn these masks off and on, the difference that is already making. Now again, going back to that original video, now that we've applied the 20 settings, we now need to apply the 10 settings, but it is slightly different at this point. Now what I will do is I will add a new mask, and again we'll choose a brush, and we're going to apply this over the eyes, across the nose, and onto the mouth. And again we come into the settings where we have the contrast, the texture and the clarity. However, we're not going to use the contrast slider. I've found that when I double up on this effect in Lightroom, that contrast slider is a bit too much, especially on the eyes. So I tend to leave that out. We'll just use the clarity and the texture. So the clarity slider, we'll take this one to 10. and the texture slider for that micro contrast will take that up to 10 as well. So now let's have a quick look at what we've got here. If we turn this off and on, the face is really starting to punch. But if we just zoom out now to say fit, we can see how it's affecting the entire picture. Let's turn that off and on, off and on. And this works an absolute treat, especially when printed. But what if you're working on a picture where you've not added an external light source into the whole scene, or you've maybe not even shot it wide open to give it a shallow depth of field? Well, that's exactly how it is with this picture here. Now, when we compare the final retouch picture to the out of camera image, we can see that yes, there has been quite a lot done to it. I did a cutout and added in that white background. However, let's have a look how this 2010 technique can give this picture a lot more punch, make the face really start to stand out, because at the moment it's very flat, it's very low contrast, and it was shot at f8 in natural or ambient light. Well, to kick things off, let's just give the whole picture just a little bit of contrast anyway. So we'll take that to around about there, and then we'll dive into the maskings tab again. And just like before, what we'll do is we'll get a brush, making sure that the feather is nice and high, the flow and density are at 100, and we'll just brush over the main part of the face, covering the eyes, the cheeks, the mouth, the lips, the nose. Cover it with that red overlay, and then we'll come to the exposure slider and just increase it a small amount to give it a little bit of lift. In this case, we're looking at 0.25, and you can see when I turn that off and on, off and on. We'll then duplicate this mask here, but tell you what, before we do that, let's just keep things organized. Let's click on the three dots and click on rename, and I'll call this face, and then click OK. So now we've renamed that mask. I'll then go back to those dots and we'll click on duplicate face. There's the copy. We now know that when we duplicate it, it's going to also bring over the exposure, which we don't want. So we'll double click on that slider to take that down to 0, because this is where we're going to use the contrast, the texture and the clarity. So again, here in the contrast, we'll take that to 20. We'll tab down to the clarity, put that to 20, and then also the texture. We'll put that into 20 as well. And in fact, up here, let's just rename this one. Keeping it organized again, we'll call that one 20. Now we need to do the eyes. So we'll click to create a new mask. We'll click to add a brush. And again, we'll brush over the eyes, across the nose, and down onto the mouth, like so. We won't use the contrast, we'll only use texture and clarity. Both of those are going to be 10. Now if we turn that off and on, straight away we can see that we're having a lot more punch. The eyes could do with lifting. There is a video I've got there where we can show how to really give the eyes some pop. But one extra little thing you could do if you really did want to just stay within Lightroom is to create a shallow depth of field. The way you could do that is we've got the face mask here. Let's just create another copy of it by doing duplicate face. We need to get rid of that exposure setting there. We'll rename this one to, we'll call this one shallow, DOF, depth of field. And then what we'll do is we'll come over to the right hand side and put a little tick in the invert checkbox. So now that mask is affecting everything except for the face. In fact, we just need to get rid of that bit just there as well. That's on the face. All right, so now that we've got that, we could just add in maybe just a little bit of negative clarity just to create a bit of softening on the outside of the face as well. So that just kind of gives that fake depth of field look within Lightroom. And again, this works an absolute treat when printed. Now, it's thanks to your questions and your comments that have made me dive into Lightroom to see if I could come up with an alternative method of doing the 20 technique in Lightroom as opposed to just doing it in Photoshop. And I'll be honest, having now played around with this, I actually think I prefer it because of the added control this gives with those three sliders, the contrast, the clarity and the texture. So thank you for those questions and comments. Please do keep them coming in because it helps with this kind of stuff. But that's pretty much all I've got for this video. If you've liked it, if it's proved helpful in any way, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, you know the score. Just click on that subscribe button because that's just a great free way that you can support this channel. But that's it. That's me. I am done. I'll see you in the next video.